Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
I thought you were going to put your name there for a second.
What?
I thought you forgot your name.
Yeah, Carrie something with a G, I think.
I mean, if ever there were a time to forget your own name, I think it
Jesus.
might be now.
Sweet baby Jesus, it is rough times.
Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable time for non-Black people, and I want everyone to know that we're right there in there with you, and that it's okay to feel uncomfortable.
In fact, we should feel uncomfortable.
Yes, you know, every Tuesday at 3:00, I'm like, therapist, remind me that it's okay to feel uncomfortable. You know,
in fact, really, we should feel uncomfortable. Like, if we're not feeling uncomfortable, what is wrong with us?
Yeah. You know, where did you get to the point where you've numbed out so much against, like, you know, fellow humans, humanity?
Yeah, although I will say, like, a small... I mean, there are a bunch of things that make me somewhat helpful, but one of them is that there's a lot more white people involved in the protests than in previous ones. And while sometimes their behavior can be problematic, I just think it's a sign that things have shifted quite a bit since Black Lives Matter first started protesting in Ferguson, when that was almost exclusively Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you see the pictures and it's different and it's bigger. And I don't know if this is some sort of silver lining to COVID with people kind of working from home, or there being more, like, something's more accessible to them because of, you know, the pandemic too. Whatever happened this time, it's different.
Yes. So I think the pandemic is part of it. So the fact that some people don't have a job to lose, so they can just protest with, like, freely. But yeah, also some people who are working from home, you know, so they're white, so they're unlikely to lose their jobs anyway, sadly. But they're perhaps even more online than they were before, and they're seeing more of the injustices. So yeah, I think the pandemic actually is playing a huge role in what we're seing.
I don't want to say good for the pandemic, but
I know, man.
What a confluence of events.
I know.
I've been often speechless, and that's good. I've been doing I try to do a lot of listening, try to speak out at the right time against fellow white people doing something. You have a tweet to read me, right? Right.
So yeah, fellow white people.
Yes.
We should be doing more listening and less talking.
Yes.
I mean, the silence is violence thing is true, but there's still a limit, right? So be parsimonious, like, don't talk over other people, basically. So this is a tweet from Studio Glibly, or at No Totally. 3 days ago, well, this is like more than 3 days ago now, but 3 days ago, some Vox journalists decided, apparently for everyone, that abolish/defund the police was bad messaging of a bad idea. Today, the white journalists are discussing what the slogan should be changed to. White people are simply not up to the challenge. So yes, stop it. We're new to this, most of us. The vast, vast, vast majority of white people are new to this discussion. So stop talking for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And to completely co-opt the message of defund the police when you're actually saying reform, or, you know, basically refund, like, or, you know, like, do, you know, give more money, but maybe to different kinds of trainings. No, that's not what this movement is about. And so it's misinformation too.
It's definitely misinformation, yeah.
And the fucking audacity to be like, let's remessage this, when Black women have been working so hard for so long on the abolition movement, and to, of course, swoop too. I mean, just whatever, come in, swing in, on a, what is that Miley Cyrus song?
On that record, what is that thing
The Wrecking
called?
Ball? Is that
The Wrecking Ball, jeez, yeah.
yeah, doing that, basically.
So this is how I'm interpreting what's going on. It's scaring them. They're like, oh, I can't imagine a world without police, which, okay, fine, like, that is a difficult thing to imagine, given that we've been living with police for hundreds of years in different forms, but still, they've been around for a long, long, long time. I can understand that fear. Right?
And they've been serving white people very well.
Yes, mostly. They've been definitely only been serving white people.
Yep.
But not always very well.
Right,
some white people are not served that well. But regardless,
yes.
It is built for us. So, yeah, okay, fair. I get that fear. I do. But like, if just because you're afraid doesn't mean that you get to decide, well, okay, that's not really what that means. Like, let me explain to you how the police could be better. Like, okay, like you can have that conversation, but you can't say that that's what abolish or defund police means.
Yeah. And the fear thing, I do get it. And I saw someone on Twitter, a few people on Twitter, Black folks on Twitter say that fear is really limiting our imaginations.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my God, 100% exactly that. Yeah, that's something that I've been remembering a lot. And I tweeted about it. I'm willing to remind white people too, that I get that your first reaction is, but will we still be safe? But you have to remember that,
we're not safe.
Yeah, and Black people have never been safe. And that's not the question that they're asking. They're like, this, defund and then abolition, that's where their safety lies. And why are we so scared to go down that route if it means, there are some people that have never been safe. And I think that it's a good reminder. Like, I do really genuinely believe there are good people that don't really think about the fact that not everyone's been safe.
Right. 100%. They just don't know. And that is fine. But that's why you have to stop and listen, right? And learn.
Exactly.
But I would also point out that there are plenty of white people, at least in certain circumstances, who are also not super safe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
trans folks, deaf folks.
Some women, victims of interpersonal violence, are not very well served by the police. That are often mocked by the police. Or told, well, he hasn't done anything yet, so... Because most of the perpetrators of this violence are men, not all. It's not really serving very many people that well. But we forget.
We absolutely forget, because we grew up in this society, this racist society.
With so much propaganda.
Yes. I mean, did you see that the show Cops was canceled?
Finally! That show was trash.
Yeah. And it's like, it was like as old as I am, basically. So like,
almost,
millennials have been growing up with Cops and shows like Law and Order, and, our media is full of propaganda.
Yeah. So much. It's good that we're finally thinking about how we can maybe at least be a little less pro-cop. just a tiny fucking bit.
Yeah, cop is a job. We should really be pro-people, right? Like, it just seems so simple. And another thing, like, it's happening again, but the Blue Lives Matter. I'm like,
oh, yeah.
Jesus fucking Christ.
That surprises me zero much. Those people are on a trip.
Yeah, it's... I mean, hopefully it's like the how do you call it? Like the dying breath of that, or at least the beginnings of it.
Yeah, I'm of two minds of this. It's definitely possible to go into very different directions. One where this is the dying gasps of the system that we've been living under for so long. And the other side is, this is, the perfect time for a true authoritarian crackdown to come.
Especially with, what's his face in office.
Right, especially with what's his face.
Yeah.
The only thing that makes me think that might not happen is he seems to be flailing around quite a bit.
Yeah. That also seems to be a death gasp over there. I'm being hopeful. I have to be.
Yes.
Yes. But yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just a big time for helping out others in ways that we can, physically can, financially can, and really listening as non-Black people. And not trying to fucking co-opt things and re-message defunding the police and abolition and all of that.
But anyway, today's interview...
These were before George Floyd was murdered. We did this interview.
We recorded it a couple months ago, I think now. So yeah, it was during the pandemic, but definitely pre-George Floyd being murdered.
And so I think that we both think that it would have taken a more somber tone if we had done the interview more recently.
And I sort of feel like some of the suggestions that come up are as if we know for sure the police are still going to exist. Like we hadn't even like contemplated. I mean, maybe we had personally, but like
Yes,
in this conversation,
it's like
we hadn't really contemplated like cops not even existing as a force.
But it's worthwhile. Like, you know, I came into the conversation 2 months ago or whatever, fully on board with abolition and that this would be a path that we should go down. But I didn't think there would be a sea change like this. Like, I thought that this was the only way, is that we would expose more people to some of the smaller, I hate to say smaller, but some of like the component parts of the system, that they could see what was happening, and then, you know, it would help in a little way. But, you know, a sea change has happened. So,
well,
hopefully.
We don't know
Hopefully,
that yet.
yeah.
A sea change has happened in terms of attitudes. The police force in most places still very much exists. Like, so for example, I think it's Camden City or something in New Jersey, they got rid of their police force, but then they reconstituted it. And we don't know what's going to happen in Minneapolis, but like my strong suspicion is they're just going to rebuild it in a slightly different way. So abolition it still seems very far off. This interview assumes that the cops are very much still going to exist, and so we're chipping away at the edges of what we can do as linguists.
Absolutely. And knowing that police interviews, which is what we talk about, that this is part of the bigger system actually working as it should, right? Like, it's not saying like this is a problem of the system. Like we've talked about, it was built on white supremacy, and, you know, these are just how kind of the system works and how it can harm people.
And there's some ways that we can make it at least somewhat less harmful, sort of.
We hope you'll remember that when you're listening to it, but it is good information that
yeah,
not everyone
for sure.
will know.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Our guest is Dr. Marianne Mason, who is an assistant professor in translation and interpretation at James Madison University. She's interested in language and the law, or forensic linguistics, translation, interpreting studies, discourse/conversational analysis, pragmatics, applied linguistics, and technology-enhanced learning. She's also the co-editor of the new book, The Discourse of Police Interviews, which is why we have her on today. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to be able to talk about the book with you guys. So yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
And it's a very important topic.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, we've actually wanted to have someone on to talk about this topic in the past. We're really happy that we managed to find someone who was willing to talk about it. So thank you. So why did you want to edit this book in particular?
You know, it goes back a long time ago to graduate school where I became interested in forensic linguistics. And since then, I've examined data ranging from covertly taped conversations or wiretaps of drug cartel members, like the Cali cartel. That was actually my dissertation. And then I saw them on the Narcos series on Netflix. So that was kind of fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Then the bilingual courtroom in federal and state courts. And most recently, police layperson exchanges in the U.S. And one of the most interesting cases I have worked on as an expert witness, like providing an expert opinion to the court, and which started this journey of the discourse of police interviews, involved a criminal case that was under appeal, in which the unequivocalness of a suspect's invocation for counsel during police interview was, questioned. So, and then, you may ask, and I ask myself, why is the suspect's invocation for counsel qualified as equivocal or unequivocal? Why is this issue even raised in police interviews? So to find the answers, I had to look at the linguistics, see, okay, why is this an issue linguistically at a discourse analysis level? And then I also had to look at the bigger picture, because then I started seeing, there's the legal aspects, the social cultural aspects, the institutional factors that all shape these types of exchanges, police layperson exchanges. And it's very complex. It has a lot of different layers to it. But very interesting. I like it.
Yeah, definitely very interesting.
Yeah.
And actually, I just realized we should actually ask you to explain what forensic linguistics is.
Forensic linguistics is a branch or a field of applied linguistics, and it basically examines issues that pertain to language and the law. So it could be applying discourse analysis research, for example, to police interviews, to police statements. So you use the theory of linguistics and apply it to different areas. So they could be discursive, textual, or oral. It could be in the field of interpreting, for example. It could be also, some people do work with phonetics, and they call it forensic phonetics or phonology. There's also author IDing or identification of authors, so they do corpus analysis. So there's a lot of different areas that can be studied. You can study the law itself, contracts. There's an array of data, if you will, that you can apply linguistic theory to, and that would be the work of a forensic linguist or language and the law person.
So within the field of forensic linguistics, why is it important to study police interviews specifically?
I started thinking about that, to think about sort of how to contextualize that and to make it something that, for everybody to sort of see, not just us who work in this field all the time, but why would this be important to everybody? I started thinking first on the exchange and why it was important. And it's an institutional exchange. It's in what we would call an asymmetrical discourse. So it's one person has power to direct the interview or that talk, and then has also the knowledge. So that's why we always talk about police interviews also as police layperson exchanges, because there's an asymmetry not only of power, but also of knowledge, because the police has information that the layperson doesn't have. Even if they're a hardened criminal, they still don't know all the information that the police has. So there's that disparity. Then also there are the issues of the social perceptions of crime and the law and suspects, even of suspects themselves. And it makes, to me, understanding this type of discourse really imperative. So the other thing that I was thinking about is also that a lot of people do not understand the process itself. So they don't know the techniques used. They don't know the law. In other words, what happens when you talk to police or taken to the station and are in custody, or you read your rights and you invoke counsel. So if what you know is what you see on TV, for example, popular cultural, Law and Order type shows, everything seems fairly benign, right? I go to the police station, my rights are read, and they think, oh, that's it. And then everything's fine. My lawyer arrives and everything's perfect. But there are many gaps to this popular knowledge, that there are exceptions to Miranda, that if you're not under arrest, your rights don't have to be read, and everything you say can still be used against you in a court. That the moment you want to remain silent or invoke counsel, the police interrogation may not stop, even if you invoke it. That you may not get a phone call for a while. You may be booked, and in some states, depending on the states, it could be 24 hours or 72 hours, depending on the jurisdiction, and you may not get a phone call because the police doesn't have to call for you. And that any statement that you give is not necessarily going to be taken verbatim, that's not true. Unlike what you see on Judge Judy, isn't this what you said in your statement? Well, no, that's not verbatim. So to me, this is in the public interest, just to kind of summarize. It's just it has so many layers but is in the public interest because any of us could be a suspect. Any of us could be under arrest.
Absolutely. So you actually wrote a chapter in this co-authored volume, and it's called The Guilt Presumptive Nature of Custodial Interrogations in the United States, the Use of Confrontation, Appeals to Self-Interest, and Sympathy/Minimization in the Reid Technique. So there's a lot in there, but Let's just start with the Reid Technique. What is that?
Okay, well, to give you a little background, and I'm going to go a little bit back to the 20s and 30s because I think it's interesting so people understand how police interviews evolved, if you will. So in the US and many other countries, police interrogations were often highly coercive and involved physical coercion. So mainly, what I'm talking about is a confession would be beaten out of you. It could. But these methods, I mean, rightly so, right, have been condemned, and they resulted in false confessions and they were obtained often through physical force. So they had no legal standing. And in the US, confessions must be voluntary to have legal effect. So now comes this police officer, John E. Reid, and he was a police officer in the 1950s, and he developed what he called a psychology-based interviewing method. So in other words, it wasn't that third degree that involved the physical coercion. He thought, let's do something more sophisticated that had the psychology-based interview. And that became that popular technique that is used widely in police, by police in the U.S. to train police officers, and it's called the Reid technique. And it has a couple of phases, just to say a little bit, not to go into all of them, but it has a fact analysis stage, which is basically the evidence. Then the one that's really important is the behavior analysis interview, because that's the one that says, depending on the suspect's body language, that's the psychology aspect. You can tell if the person's lying or they're trying to conceal information, that kind of thing. And then they had these 9 steps of interrogation. Not all of them have to happen in an interrogation, and some get kind of melded together. But some of them would be like positive confrontation, where the person's confronted with supposed facts and shifting blame, minimizing the suspect's denials, because that's not good in a Reid technique. Give options, you did this, because, maybe you weren't in your right mind, you were angry, that kind of thing. And then also documenting. Trying to document the confession if you get one, or the admission. But in the US, most police interrogations, and abroad, many places, they're not video recorded, which is something that forensic linguists who do this type of research want. We want this to be part of the reform. All police interviews need to be video recorded.
Absolutely.
They definitely do.
Well, I'm hearing, so you talked about like in the 20s and 30s and before the Reid technique, there was this physical coercion. When you describe the Reid technique to me, I'm just hearing emotional coercion.
Yeah.
Is that kind of accurate?
It is. It is
accurate.
It is definitely accurate because it's a way to get you to give a confession. And all of the techniques they're going to cause stress, because coercion is stressful, and being told multiple times, every time you deny it, being told, stop lying, tell us the truth, that is coercive. And as a suspect, you don't know the charges, so you don't know all of the information, and you're being told a variety of things. And yes, it is highly stressful, and you're also, let's say you're at a police station, and maybe you are in handcuffs, or you're just there, but you can't leave, you're in custody. So that is extremely stressful as well, because most of us have never experienced that in our lives. And you don't know. You just want to go home. Most people want to go home. They don't want to be arrested. They don't want to go to jail. And they want to avoid it at all costs. And that's normal. It is definitely very emotional. And listening to police interrogations is difficult, actually, at times. It is very emotional, yes.
Yeah, I would definitely have a hard time with that, for sure. I met someone I don't think he lives here anymore, but he did live in Phoenix, and he went to this police training for the Reid technique, and I was shocked because first of all, he's not in the police; he's just like some random person who just happened to be able to go and get. Anyway, it's just shocking to me, like knowing everything that I know about this, that it was still being taught as an actual technique.
Oh, yes, it is widely used in the United States. It's actually, it's a big business too. It's done very well. And police officers are told that this is the best technique, that this is a technique that gets results. And, so we also have to understand that is an institutional thing. So, I sometimes want to make that difference between the police, and also the institution, because the police officers are being trained this way. They're being told that this is the best way to go. And they are, I have talked to many police officers that later became professors like of forensic evidence and other things. And they have told me, we used to do this. We were told that this is the best way, but we always, some of us, we didn't like it. We were uncomfortable. We thought that there had to be something better. So I always like to point that out because, it's not just about, the police are always doing these things and they want a course. It's not that simple. And there are many police that may not, be with, in agreement with that. But it is what they are trained to do and what they really are told is the best way. Now, there are other countries that are doing things that are much better, including Canada, which actually they used to use the Reid technique and they stopped. They said, no more. We're not going to do Reid. We're going to use something similar to PEACE, which is used in the UK and in many parts in Europe.
Yeah, briefly describe PEACE for us, will you?
Okay, well, PEACE stands for Planning and Preparation. So I'm just going to give you, I actually wrote them down, the little acronym, so I can tell you what it is, which is prior. You plan prior to the interview, then explain and engage. And that is actually to establish rapport, to ease people, to make them feel more comfortable. And then account, which is at the part of the interviewing, closure and evaluation. That's the two last parts. And that can be to summarize and record the interview. And what happened is that PEACE came about similarly to what we're having, what happens in the U.S., but we haven't had the reform, is that they wanted to move away from coercion and implement something that they call best police interviewing practices. So that, they minimize the false confessions and the coercion. And this started in the mid-'80s in the UK, if my memory serves me right. And it came as a desire to change that confrontational tactics that we see in Reid, and then having a more information gathering process, which can happen in an interview, but really cannot happen in an interrogation. So that was really the main purpose of PEACE. It was a way of changing how things were done. And they also talk about, the importance of video recording, which is still not done across the board, but it is part of it to change in every aspect. And there's a lot of things that are going on in Australia and in the UK that we are just lagging behind in the US. And when I get, I go to conferences or talk to colleagues, they're like, when are you going to get your act together in the U.S.? And I'm like, I don't know. It would be nice, but I don't know.
Well, I'm thinking about the Reid technique versus something like PEACE. With Reid, it feels, okay, so we have this very confrontational method. It doesn't feel like we're trying to get to, justice. It's more like we're trying to get to punishment and consequences. Whereas with PEACE, it seems like a step toward harm reduction and all of these things that a lot of prison reformists are asking for. It just seems like Reid is standing in the way of any meaningful change when it comes to this area of the law.
Yes. The truth is that what happened is that in PEACE, even though PEACE is still not false confession proof, and they're still working on, because it's difficult, with police interviews, there's always going to be issues. We have vulnerable populations. There's a lot of different aspects to it. But what they want is to obtain investigatively useful information. So that's why they interview. They want a free narrative. They want to establish rapport. And in many countries, lying is unethical and it cannot be done in a police interview. Whereas in the US, the law, and that's something that I wanted to talk a little bit about, the part of what's going on with Reid is facilitated by the law. In some places, you cannot lie to suspects. You can lie to an extent in the U.S. So there's that issue of ethics that, and then the issue of invocation is one of the things that really opened my eyes about why we still have methods like Reid, and that definitely has to change as well, the law.
What is the difference between someone saying, can I get a lawyer versus get me a lawyer?
Well, can I get a lawyer is a request that is formulated indirectly. So, and in the English language, we formulate requests often indirectly. The English language has an aversion to directness in a way. And this has social and cultural, underpinnings. So, it's just how the language works. But a request can be formulated indirectly, but have what we call a conventional direct meaning, without any ambiguity. So let me give you another example. When you tell someone, can you pass the salt, right? Unless you're physically unable to do so, the only meaning it can have is a request to pass me the salt, give it to me, right? So saying that an utterance that's formulated indirectly always has or potentially has that ambiguous or dual meaning is not correct from a linguistic standpoint. On the other side of this, we got get me a lawyer, and that is a request that's formulated directly. And so, in other words, the meaning and how it's formulated, form and function, it would be, the same. But especially in asymmetrical context and with people that you don't know and where you may be facing charges, is it definitely to think that a suspect is going to tell a police officer in that setting, get me a lawyer, is not something that we can realistically say most people are going to do. Some might.
Well, I'm a little bit uncomfortable hearing it because I'm like, I was socialized as a woman. Yeah. I feel like I have like these requests that are very indirect that I was socialized with, where get me a lawyer sounds aggressive to me. Yeah, and I wouldn't want to be aggressive, or maybe I would. I don't know how I would react in this situation.
No, you would not. you would not want to be.
Yeah.
Because it's a person in authority. They have a gun. I guarantee that you would not want to be aggressive.
Yeah, in a setting like this, yes. Most of us wouldn't because we've been socialized not to be direct when you're making requests to begin with. And then in a setting like this, absolutely. It could be face-threatening. It could be perceived as impolite. You might also be trying to gauge. You may be indirect because you're trying to gauge to see, well, what do they have? Is it better for me to be polite? Is it better for me to be direct or to talk or not? So, and that part happens in any conversation, but yeah, it's true. All these factors come into play.
This also reminds me of that horrible case a couple years ago, I think it was, where someone asked for a lawyer, dog, and they decided it meant a dog that was a lawyer somehow.
Yes, all these games. And the law is where all of this started, which is the thing. Because when I got the case, the first time that I encountered this, I was like, is this not a linguistic issue? And I was talking to the lawyer, and I'm like, is this really an issue in the courts? Is this serious? Because I couldn't believe it. As a linguist, I didn't understand what the issue was.
Were they using this as a way to say X person didn't really ask for a lawyer, so we didn't get them one?
Actually, well, what happens is that's what happened in practice, right? They invoked, and then there's a game that's played during the police interview. And I'll talk a little bit about the law so you can see how that can happen. And then what happens is that the person ends up confessing. So this is when I worked with the attorney, and it's usually how it happens, is during the appeals phase. So they appealed, and what they wanted to do was to throw the confession out. But to throw it out, they had to say that it was obtained illegally, that the person actually had invoked counsel, and people have the right to invoke counsel. So they were taught, it's on constitutional basis. So what happened is that they hired me to, they said, could you work on the case and tell, write a report, give an expert opinion of why this person invoked counsel unequivocally, because the other side and how it was ruled said that he had done so equivocally. So hence the police interrogation did not have to stop, and his confession can be entered into evidence, and that's that. So this mess, all of it started after Miranda. So basically, the Miranda warning it informs suspects of their right to silence and counsel. So that's your 5th, 6th Amendment rights. And you have to be informed of these rights. There are some exceptions, but just to keep going with this. And then the suspect then may invoke their rights or not. Or they may waive them. And usually there's a form that goes with that you're supposed to sign that you have waived them. There are a lot of issues with understanding Miranda, but that's another issue later on. But this is the most pivotal point in a police interrogation, because invoking that right to silence or counsel may interfere with Reid's main goal, which is to get suspects to talk with police. So here is where the law and with invoking and Reid work together. I mean, even if it wasn't meant to work together, it's just how it came about.
And work together against the suspect and for the police.
Exactly. Even if that wasn't the intent, that's how it just ended up being. So in Miranda versus Arizona, which is the ruling, that was from 1966, the Supreme Court ruling, just to give you that little bit of background, if a suspect indicated in any matter, and at any stage that they wanted to consult an attorney, the police questioning had to end. It had to cease. But the ruling didn't say how the invocation had to be formulated to take effect. There were some other legal rulings after that tried to define it, but none of them really did until the case that really changed a lot, everything, which was Davis versus United States. And that was in 1994. And that Supreme Court ruling basically said, and I'm going to sort of a little bit cite this, is it narrowed the scope in which a suspect can invoke counsel. And the ruling states that invocations for counsel must be performed in a manner that a reasonable police officer deems unequivocal before they are given any legal effect. Police officers were suggested to ask clarification if unclear, but it's not part of the main ruling. And it doesn't have to be observed. All the legal precedents after Davis, it shows that invocations that are formulated then indirectly, like I think I need an attorney or can I talk to an attorney, were often considered equivocal. So Davis created a dilemma that when you see it in light of Reid, those two things are not working together, because Davis is saying, well, let's not interfere. Let's not put too many roadblocks for the police to interview suspects. And so they're able to do so. And then they said, so the invocation has to be clear. It cannot be ambiguous. But then if you have Reid, you're trained to, we want to get this confession, then those two things are not going to work together, because then if I have this kind of loophole, if you will, I'm going to say, well, this person say, can I get a lawyer? And I thought he was asking, can you get me one? Or do you have the ability to get one? Rather than invoking one. And if that happens, then the person can, it won't stop, and then they might confess, which is the goal of Reid, to get a confession. So those things did not work together.
And going back to what you said earlier, confessions in the U.S. must be voluntary. And so this is what they're trying to get at. This is their end goal. And I'm frustrated because the whole reasonable police officer, like there leaves so much room for wiggle room and loopholes there. And that's what you're seeing here with this case that you looked at.
Absolutely,
right?
Yes. And there have been legal scholars like Janet Ainsworth and other people who have written about this. These are professors of law who have looked at the unequivocalness and equivocal argument. And they found, and I'm finding in some research that I'm doing, I received an ACLS fellowship, and I'm looking at legal rulings, federal court rulings. I'm looking at hundreds of them to see what they say, based on invocations for counsel, what the rulings are and the arguments that the judges give. And that is most definitely the case. This issue of ambiguity is raised, and then the judges may take the Davis ruling and say, well, it's reasonable because the person didn't formulate the invocation directly.
Is anyone actually listening to linguists about this?
We want more of that, and that's why it's great, this opportunity to talk to you in the podcast. And I think there's some issues. I think in Europe, definitely, from what I see with my colleagues, there's a lot of work. They work, a coordination, so I'm not sure to say coordination, but people just work together in a more interdisciplinary way. So you see criminologists, police departments, linguists, forensic linguists, of course, working all to, people that do research in this field. A lot of them work together with other people that are in the law, that are in policing, to try to, have better practices and change things when needed. But that doesn't happen so much here. What I've seen a lot, and if you look at like the Innocence Project, and, they do great work. I think it's amazing. So there's no criticism on that. But there's a lot of the science Because I still think that there's this notion that linguistics, it cannot be, something that is not an opinion. It's actually can be factual as well. Just as good as DNA in some ways, at least with invocations and things like that. We can say unequivocally, give an opinion. But unfortunately, I don't know if it's just how things are, just how they have evolved, that there tends to be more of a preference for things that are more science-based. And the forensic linguists, we're just not, we want to be, and we have really good forensic linguists in the U.S. and in Europe, of course. And but it's still a challenge. We do work with a lot of attorneys, so that's where I think we make a lot of our mark. But I think some of us want change. I think a lot would like some reforms, and that's the hardest. What I've felt personally, I think is the hardest part, to get involved in that conversation.
Yeah. And I think with the Innocence Project, the reason why they focus so much on DNA is because they want to prove actual innocence, which is very difficult. And just undoing a confession by way of saying, hey, this person actually invoked a lawyer is not really in their wheelhouse.
No, absolutely.
So,
no, and they're doing amazing work. I mean, I think about all the people. But, when you look at the Central Park 5 case, which, of course, the DNA, the innocent, that was pivotal. But then when you look at that confession, you realize it all started there. It all started with that confession. So that's where we could be and play that role. And I would like more of that. I would like more of that in the U.S., that we do more of that interdisciplinary. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, that we can work more together. Everybody, the law, the people that do the science, all these different organizations that are doing amazing work, that we could all be part of it and give, our knowledge. And I think that would be really good, because we need the reform.
You brought up the Central Park 5, and that just reminds me how younger people can be so vulnerable to this type of coercion. Like, I'm like, in my 30s, and I would be very vulnerable to this type of coercion, but I'm thinking of 18, 19-year-olds. This is just...
Well, they were younger than that.
Were they under 18?
Some were minors, yes.
At the time?
Yes.
Most of them were minors.
Yes, they were. Well, they would be considered vulnerable population, part of the vulnerable populations, which would be children, victims of sexual assault, and non-native speakers of English as well, because it's any group that could be at a disadvantage at any, in a police interview, for a variety of reasons. It could be cognitive, it could be cultural, linguistic, because if they don't speak the language. So that is something that also it's very important. And there's a group, actually, the Communication of Rights group. They put forth these guidelines for communicating rights to non-native speakers. And a lot of the researchers in that group also discuss, peace and talk about vulnerable populations. There's a lot of work being done in that area, especially from what I can tell. And I don't want to miss anybody in the U.S., but I've seen a lot of the work done in the U.K. with vulnerable populations and linguistics, forensic linguistics. So, and they talk about what things need to be done to ensure that people understand their Miranda rights when they're not native speakers, because there are a variety of factors. And because someone can speak a language or seem like they understand, that does not mean that they have sufficient comprehension. And then the other issue is that police are not trained in assessing language proficiency, and they may be unaware of communication difficulties.
Well, I'm thinking about all these loopholes again, too, and just thinking about how the Reid technique works. Would it not be an advantage to the police officers to kind of feign ignorance when it comes later and saying, we didn't know that X person didn't understand what we were saying?
Yeah, and I think it goes to Reid. I go back to that because, and it goes to other factors. I'm not, this is more from what I've been able to talk with people who teach criminology, who, and former police officers. But there seems, and I'm going to say this because this is not my area of expertise, but from what, sort of what I've heard, is that in U.S. policing, there is this thing, this fast results, expediency. That's part of Reid as well. A lot of police officers have a lot of pressures of, clearing their desk, if you will. You got this case, partly because, they gathered evidence for the DAs, and DAs, they're elected officials. They want to show, especially in some places, that they're, we're tough on crime. So we want to get results fast. I think that definitely played a big role in the Central Park 5, because it was like, I remember I was in New York. It was a horrible thing that happened. The victim, it was horrific, right? And everybody was outraged. And I understand everybody felt unsafe, not being able to, go out and jog and what have you. And what happened of course, to her, to the victim. And they wanted results. They wanted to get the people that did this. And then there's all that pressure. And then the police with Reid and all these other things, then it's like, we want to get this confession. And yes, I think that's the driving force of why the coercion is part of Reid, is part of how the interrogation process is. So yes, I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. Absolutely. And they're not good for the suspect. And in this case, the Central Park Five, yes, it was, a travesty, definitely, yeah.
It's also not good for the victim because there was one person, there was one man who raped her, and that was not the person who was incarcerated for the crime. So how does that help anybody?
It doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. But this is the thing that, and again, others, criminologists might talk a little bit more about this, but, and it's what's led to reform in other places, is that we want real information. We want accurate information, but that takes more time probably than just asking someone, you did it. And until the person says I did it, regardless of, if it's true or if they gave all the correct information. Coercion is the most popular, one of the most popular techniques used in Reid. Basically, is confronting the suspect. So I'm going to kind of rephrase it, is that you tell him, I have this evidence on you, you have to tell us what you did. You're given time limited offer, like you have to tell us now, we won't be able to help you later. So that kind of thing is what I found in the cases that I worked on, and also in general, looking at the research, that is very common. And some of them can be very coercive because it's that pressure, that they put on the person, and then the person denies, and they're back to don't deny. We're not going to accept your denial. The only technique that actually I saw that has some effect, but they went quickly back to coercion. I think for expediency, I can't really be sure about that one, but it was empathy and rapport, and and that one actually is the only technique that I saw in my research where the suspect actually provided some investigatively useful information, but it was taking longer. The person was very emotional, crying. They were both crying, and it just was very difficult. So it wasn't given enough time, and they reverted back to confrontation with evidence and time, So it's interesting. It's interesting that things that might work but might take a little bit more time, again, that's the issue of we need to change things, because I think the police, if, could have things that would be much better for them to get the information that they need without having to get any false confessions, having to use coercion, and be more effective. Empathy is very important. Empathy is extremely important. In Europe, they talk about it. One of the chapters in the book, who's a psycholinguist and he's a specialist, it was a co-authored, and he was one of the principal, people, and when the peace, that led to the peace reform, Reid, and he talks about the role of empathy, but one of the things they say is it has to be ethical. You cannot lie. It has to be truthful. But it works. They find it to be, very useful.
And I feel like not just in police interviews, but empathy on a larger scale in our criminal justice system is desperately needed. And it's no surprise to me that, the carrot versus the stick? Of course, the carrot works better. Well, that's a bad example because that's like tricking someone or trapping someone. But, what is it? Honey versus, honey. I don't know. Yeah, honey
versus vinegar.
Yes, honey versus vinegar. There we go.
I know it's true, but there are two things, and this is again conversations that I've had after giving presentations with people in the law and criminologists, is that they've told me, the law has to change because the law gives that sort of that loophole, if you will, that ability. And then there's also cultural things that have to change. We have to change this expediency and tough on crime, that you got to get this done now. Even if it doesn't matter if you get it right, you have to get it done. And that's part of our sort of legal law enforcement structure, that it's just, it's institutional. I always say it goes beyond, the police. Is the institution, the legal institution, the law enforcement institutions. It's bigger, and that has to, all that culture, if you will, has to change. And our social perceptions, I think, of crime and of suspects have to change as well. But that's going to take a lot of change, and I'm hopeful, but it's difficult. It's not going to be easy.
No, it's not. And I get why I get why people get so scared and they want to find the person quickly, because if it's someone, especially if they've done something really violent and really horrific, you're scared and you don't want them like roaming around hurting other people. But the problem is if you get the wrong person, you haven't solved the problem at all. You've just allowed them to still hurt people. So for those people who are really fearful, I encourage them to think about it for a second and think it's better to get the right person, even if it takes longer.
Yes, absolutely. It's true, because we don't want then another injustice to be committed, that someone who did not commit a crime then gets charged with a crime or goes to jail for something that they didn't do, or that they weren't as involved, or all the other possible factors. So I agree, but then that's going to have to, it takes that social change and how we see things. And and it's true, police will tell you, most of the people are here, and it's true. They go and they have to deal with people that are criminals, and it's not pleasant, and it's and they might, and they probably lie, it's just how it is, if they are guilty, obviously again, no one wants to go to jail, but we have to see big picture, and that takes a lot, I think, and a lot of change is going to take of how the police, they interact with, how they're trained to interact. There's been this movement for community policing, more of that needs to be done as well, because it's important, because then it creates that more of that sort of that empathy and the rapport with others. And that needs to happen. But I think there are groups of people that want, even in law enforcement, that want this change as well. But it's not easy.
Yeah, it requires a cultural shift on the part of all of us, and I think that's why it's so hard.
Yeah, and then the institutional, it's true, and the public, and then the law. A lot of people say the law needs to change, because then the law dictates the rest, and there is a lot of truth to that. But then I'm thinking that will take rulings from federal court judges and Supreme Court judges, and that's something I'm looking at that in my study that I'm doing now. I'm looking at the judges and how they rule and appointments and all these things, and the Supreme Court and federal judges are really important. They determine a lot of what happens in our even day-to-day people's lives. So to think you're exempt from that, you're not. You may not be, in your lifetime. So I think that's really important as well. And I don't think it doesn't get enough focus either. So
no, it doesn't. It does on the right quite a bit. They really worry about their Supreme Court judges, but yes. The left just hasn't woken up to this issue.
Yes, it's important, because the rulings, as I said, these are Supreme Court rulings, Davis and Miranda. So they are very important. And they can change the culture, if you will. They can facilitate. And of course, Reid being what it is and the other factors, it was all like this, all these ingredients come together in a perfect way, imperfect, but, and then create something that now, we're dealing with still, and that we need to reform. It's a lot. It's a lot of pieces in the puzzle, I think.
Do you think that there's anything that our listeners or that Carrie and I can do to help move this shift forward?
One of the things that I'm thinking and that I'm going to start doing, but, of course, we have we have a pandemic right now, things that everybody's thinking about. But, these, not very recently, it's been very popular shows on confessions. I don't know if you've seen them on
the confession tapes,
Netflix, and there are a lot of cases and I think maybe, when we see stories that come on the news, maybe more people getting involved, writing op-eds, having, or just talking about them. I think just being out there is something that's going to be really important. Just to remind people that this is an issue, and have that be part of the discourse. I think that would be really important. That it's out there, and that we're paying attention, and it's something that I'm interested in doing now after the book. I'm going to be paying a lot more attention of cases that come out, maybe having responses to these things, so that it's out there. So it's not just academics. Research is really important, but it of course is part of our academic life. But sometimes it's not as it doesn't maybe translate as easily to the public, or they don't have as much access because maybe they don't use it in their day-to-day lives. So I think we need to find more ways to make things that are accessible for everybody, and that are part of the discussion. So that's something too that we need to do maybe a little bit more as researchers and academics, is to also have that other part, that we put our work out there as well. And it's hard because we get trained in a way to do things a certain way and to write a certain way. And all of a sudden you're like, okay, writing an op-ed, that's a new genre that that if you haven't, been writing on, you have to get used to. And it's not something that we do all the time. So I think that's something that's needed too. But I think on the end of the podcast, yes, I think maybe just, having that discussion a little bit more, even just putting it out there for everybody to kind of remind, the listeners that this is going on. I think that would help a lot, the discussion.
Well, yeah, now that if I see something that says read technique, I'm going to click on it and read and see if anything is happening. Why is this person talking about the read technique? So I mean, now it's hard to not know once you know, right? So knowledge is the first step.
Well, if you listen to Undisclosed, they talk about it all the time.
It's true. And then and there's, a lot of the shows, and any case, there was this case, and I remember this poor girl, because, her father, I think, taught at JMU or teaches at JMU. It was the case of the Barnard student in New York. She was murdered, and it just happened not that long ago. Very sad. She was very young, student, just, going to class, going about her life. But I remember there were a lot of issues with, because some of them were minors, and then they were being interviewed. And I think the new NYPD kind of knew that they had to be careful about how they handled the case. And that came about after the Central Park Five. So I think there is an understanding probably in the bigger cities, but then we also have to think about, well, what about smaller communities? Because we don't know so much about what's going on there. So there's, but I think anytime this comes to the headlines and it's out there, I think it's a great opportunity to sort of revisit the topic, to think about confessions and what is going on. But I do think they handled that case very differently because of what happened with the Central Park Five. I think there has been some change locally, at least, but we need more, and we need it to be consistent.
Yeah, we need people to get the same treatment.
Yes,
everywhere.
Exactly, we do.
No matter what they look like or who they are. Exactly.
So that's very, very important. So you're doing. I appreciate greatly, the opportunity, and I think you're doing. I looked at other work that you were doing in your podcast, and I think it's really important. And to have a place where linguists can also talk. I know you're doing that work as well, and I think you also know that it's something. It's an area that is relevant to everything. Discourse is in everything. It's in politics. It's in everything. Yet, if it's not like something about the economy, they're not putting it in the news. You know what I mean? Or finance. Even though discourse is everywhere, and we are part of, and we should be part of that discussion. But that presence, if you will, to be there. So it's good that you have this, because I don't think it's as common, to have that focus with the podcast and things, and people that have that background, that we all understand each other. I think that's very important what you're doing. So we appreciate it.
The work that you're doing is very, very important. So we appreciate
definitely.
you for doing that. For doing that work. And it sounds so hard, but so important. So thank you so much for talking to us about this. And going back to
thank
empathy,
you.
it just helps grow empathy in people to even know that this is happening to other people.
And that it could happen to any of us.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. It can. And it's a scary, it's a scary experience. So you have to think about that and have that empathy. Exactly. Because it can happen to any of us. Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. And we always leave our listeners with a final message.
Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole. Okay, so this month we would like to thank new patrons. Anshel Schaefer Cohen. I hope that is the right way to say that.
Thank you.
Matthew Gilboy.
Yay.
Jordan K.
Yay.
Kia Johnson. Again, I hope that's the right way to say it. And Melissa Bassberg, our former guest.
Oh, thank you, everyone. I mean, especially during the COVID and just such uncertain times.
Yes, thank you so much.
It does feel very humbling to have support. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And
we
for
really do.
Anyone else who wants to become a patron, you can join us at patreon.com/vocalfriespod. And if you're interested in our bonus episodes, you can join at the $5 a month level.
Thank you.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at vocalfriespod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.